Baseball has been around for over 150 years, and there have been plenty of great teams that have dazzled us with significant play, dominant runs, and bringing home the Commissioner's Trophy during that time. But there have also been some massive stinkers as well, and the good news is every MLB team has had a bad year or two. In this video, I'll be looking at every MLB team's worst season. A couple criteria, as I must stress this isn't going by the worst record or stat-wise per se, but what I believe to be their worst overall season, also from a team morale and state of the franchise standpoint. Also, I will be going in descending order starting at 30 and working my way to 1, which is the worst team on this list. So, if you're surprised I left some teams off, sorry to disappoint. This is every MLB team's worst season, and let's get it started. Kicking off the list at number 30, the 1998 Montreal Expos. Yes, this is the quote best of the teams, but they were still terrible, so congrats on winning an ugly contest, Montreal. I could have given it to their inaugural 1969 season, 1976, or 2008, but those seasons all had silver linings to them. 1969 was their first season, 1976 got them closer to a competitive team in the 80s with some pieces in that lineup, and 2008 allowed them to draft Steven Strasburg in 2009. But 1998, despite a better record than those seasons, this was when the franchise was at their lowest point. It was 4 years after the citizens of Montreal felt like they were robbed of a title. They were still competitive from 1995 to 97, and in that 97 season, Pedro Martinez won Cy Young. But in the offseason, they traded Pedro to the Red Sox in a trade that ended up being a fleece, and that was the last of Montreal's stacked teams from the 80s and 90s. Having Vlad Sr. on your roster is a nice consolation prize, I guess, but none can fill the void that Pedro had on the team and shows how you can suffer heavily from losing an ace. Montreal finished 65 and 97. They moved to DC just 7 years later, and they wouldn't even make the playoffs or finish above 500 until 2012. Number 29, the 1923 Boston Red Sox. It may not have been their worst record, but going 61 and 91 and finishing last shouldn't be taken lightly. This was them in the midst of their long rebuild as they lacked star power and depth. They batted just .262 as a team, only hit 34 total homers, 525 RBIs, and just 584 runs. These were all dead ball era numbers, so you may have to take it a little bit with a grain of salt, but if I give an asterisk for every team, I wouldn't even make this list. Their pitching had a .420 ERA, allowed 804 runs, struck out 412 batters, and had a frightening .148 whip. Their best pitcher was a guy who won 20 games but also lost 17 and had an ERA of .378. So those are all pretty bad, but what makes this the worst season in team history to me is that this was year 4 of life with no Babe Ruth. Their hated rivals and the team that cucked them in the Babe Ruth deal, the Yankees, ended up winning their first ever World Series title. Boston continued to struggle throughout the 1920s as they didn't finish above 500 until 1937 and didn't make the World Series until 1946. Nearly 30 years after their last World Series appearance and the aforementioned sale of the Babe, while they continued to watch the Yankees cuck them and win titles. Nowadays, it's almost the exact opposite. Number 28, the 2017 San Francisco Giants. The Giants went 62 and 100 in 1985, but at least that season left hope for the franchise, and they went on to make the World Series in 1989. 2017, when they went 64 and 98, clinches it for the G-Men because it was a year after they made the playoffs and they received generally positive predictions going into the season. San Francisco was predicted to be a top 10 team by most MLB analysts, and despite the lack of noise made by the team in the offseason, Many believed that if their bullpen stayed strong, they could make noise. All their bullpen did was blow games worse than Monica Lewinsky in the 90s, and the offense was lackluster all season. They finished tied with the worst record in the MLB with Detroit, who they ironically beat in the World Series just 5 years ago, and this kickstarted an even more strange trend for the franchise, being not bad enough to tank, but not good enough for a deep playoff run either. Number 27, the 1992 Los Angeles Dodgers. The Dodgers have not had a 100-loss season since 1908, but this lands on my list because it was the worst they had since World War II, when their roster was depleted by it and when the franchise moved to LA. The pitching staff, normally a strength for LA, couldn't bail them out of compiling a 3.41 ERA, but also getting little to no support. Dodgers suffered several key injuries this season and even had the outfield of dreams with Eric Davis, Brett Butler, and Darryl Strawberry. Even with the decent attendance, Dodger Stadium felt emptier than ever, and their massive slumps from more contributors and dropped their record by 30 games from 1991. Eric Karros did win Rookie of the Year as a silver lining, but it's hard to see where this came from, and this season killed a lot of hope Dodger fans had going forward, although they would be fine. Number 26, the 2011 Minnesota Twins. The Twins have had plenty of awful teams, and those included teams that lost 100 games, but at least those teams you'd figured they'd suck because of previous seasons. The reason I give it to their 63-99 season in 2011 is because in 2010, the Twins won the AL Central for the 6th time since 2002 and second consecutive division crown, but got swept in the ALDS. Never guess who they lost to in the playoffs. Oh, how'd you know it was the Yankees? Anyway, in that 2010 season before, St. Paul hero Joe Mauer was extended for 8 years and awarded a $184 million deal to make him the highest paid catcher in MLB history for his 2009 MVP season, and he turned in another All-Star season in 2010. But in 2011, he injured his knee and required surgery, and his legs were never the same again. So much that he was forced to move from catcher to first base. Worst part, the Twins did nothing to supplement Mauer either. The only remotely good offensive player they had was Michael Kadire, whose 2011 season was his first ever All-Star game in 10 seasons in the league, and Jim Thome, who got 600 homers that season, but he was well past his prime. Their pitching had a .460 ERA, struck out 940 batters, and gave up 804 runs, but their 1.44 whip made it worse than it actually was. This season kickstarted the Twins slowly torturing their fans throughout the 2010s, and Mauer's contract lives in infamy as his best season came in 2015, where he played 158 games but had mediocre stats. Just a cautionary tale to never put all your eggs in one basket. Number 25, the 2024 Anaheim Angels. Believe it or not, the Angels are the only active franchise that has never had a 100-loss season, but they came really close to that in 2024. In their first season without Shohei Ohtani, Anaheim struggled mightily all season, going 63-99, and if not for a garbage time win against the Astros when they lost the first 3 games of the first 4 games of the series, they'd have gone 62-100. Their pitching was below average, but not horrifically bad, but the offense was really missing Ohtani as they batted a collective .229 and just scored 635 runs. Literally adding injury to insult, Mike Trout tore his meniscus and was ruled out for an indefinite period of time early in the season. Now the Angels are just spinning the tires of either being competitive or rebuilding, but as a fan of a team who went through that, let me just tell you, it won't work well. The Angels still haven't had a winning season since 2015, and that includes Ohtani and Trout winning 4 MVPs in that time span. And I thought being a Pirates fan was awful. Number 24, the 2001 Pittsburgh Pirates. I am well versed in failure and depression as a Pirates fan. You could literally pick any season from 1993 to 2012 and since 2016 and you wouldn't be wrong. Most fans would go with 1993, 2010, 2021, 2022, or even this season. 1952 also saw the most losses in team history in the modern era, and while all those seasons were terrible, I'd say 2001 is the worst in franchise history. It was a year the Bucks had optimism. 2000 was seen as a bad year due to injuries, and their brand new stadium in PNC Park was done and ready for action, an awesome ballpark that offered an experience like never before. I don't know in what way they meant that, but you surely got something you never saw before. Brian Giles had a solid season, but when Jason Kendall has a bad year and it was clear he was never the same after his gruesome injury a few years before, Lloyd McClendon literally stealing first base, the Pirates were never over 500 at any point in the season, and new GM Dave Littlefield, who was their third GM that season, began to cut costs. Sounds like another owner the Pirates have now, huh? This was the season that killed any optimism Pirates fans had going forward, even though there were some promises along the way. But if you want to know where the so-called pessimism comes from Yinzers, I think it comes from 2001. Number 23, the 1982 Cincinnati Reds. Sometimes a single season can feel like the crumbling of a dynasty, and for the 1982 Reds, it was exactly that. Just a decade prior, Cincinnati was the envy of baseball, the big red machine running rampant over the league and hoarding titles. But by 82, the gears had ground to a halt, and this was a team utterly unrecognizable from its glory years. The Reds ended with its worst record in their franchise's history at the time at 61 and 101, their first 100-loss season in franchise history. Offensively, the Reds stumbled to a .249 team average. No Red hit more than 17 home runs, and on the mound, the story was the same. Mario Soto was the sole bright spot, tossing over 250 innings with 274 strikeouts, but the rest of the staff was battered for a team ERA of .413. The bullpen was leaky, and the defense wasn't doing them any favors either. By the All-Star break, hope was already dead in the water, and the Reds spent the second half as the NL's punching bag. 1982 served as a rude awakening for a proud franchise and killed the last members of the 70s. Number 22, the 1987 Cleveland Indians, going on up to Northern Ohio now as we talk about this team. I almost jokingly went with 2021 just because it was their last year as the Indians and missed the playoffs, and I almost considered 1991 where they lost 105 games, which is the most in franchise history. But in that season, they had early pieces of their core that they competed with in the mid-90s to early 2000s that made them a powerhouse. But in 1987, Cleveland went 61 and 101, the worst record in all of baseball, their second 100-loss season in the last 3 years, and the Tribe had nowhere near as much hope as they did in the early 90s. To make things worse, Joe Carter and Corey Snyder appeared on Sports Illustrated's cover on April 6th that hyped the team, and they were even called the best team in baseball by SI and Cleveland's dumbass fans as well. Even though those two had fantastic seasons, Cleveland's pitching was among the worst in the league that bolstered a horrific team ERA of .528, walked 606 batters, allowed 219 homers, gave up a franchise record 957 runs, and an appalling 153 whip. Not once was Cleveland above 500 all season, started 1-10, 8-20 at the end of May, and their low point was a 17-0 blowout loss at home to the White Sox on July 5th, which was their worst home loss in franchise history. Indian uprising, more like Lake Erie runoff. Number 21, the 1993 San Diego Padres. So much failure to choose from with the Padres. I could have chosen their debut season, back-to-back 102-loss seasons in 73 and 74, or the early post-Gwynn years, but I went with 1993 when they finished a woeful 61 and 101 because they had Gwynn and wasted one of the best seasons with no offensive support. Offensively, the Padres hit .262 as a team and managed a respectable 134 homers, but outside of Phil Plantier's 34 bombs and Gary Sheffield's steady production, there was little reason to tune in. The pitching was uninspiring at best with a team ERA of .450. They won 82 games in 1992, and while they may not have been overwhelming favorites, people could have at least expected them to battle. What really stings is that the front office shipped off Fred McGriff to Atlanta mid-season, all but waving the white flag by July. For a stretch, the Padres lost 13 of 14 games and never recovered from this summer freefall, finishing a staggering 43 games behind the division-winning Braves. Number 20, the 2008 Seattle Mariners. I'll give the Mariners a pass for their first few seasons, but 2008 I won't be so lenient to. They went 88 and 74 in 2006 and had promise going into 2008 despite missing the playoffs. They had a nice nucleus of hitters and pitchers they added to the team in the offseason, and then they had a 100-loss season, good for the worst record in the American League and second worst in all of baseball. The supposed prolific and promising offense was quiet all season, and they kept wasting outings by King Felix. Hey, kind of similar as to what another team in the league named after a sailor of some sort does nowadays with another pitcher who has GOAT potential. This season was so bad and disappointing, Seattle fired their GM, fielding coach, and released Richie Sexson and Jose Vidro. Even more insulting, the Mariners finished with the same record in 2010, but at least then you knew where they were going to suck. Number 19, the 1978 Toronto Blue Jays. The Jays haven't had a ton of awful seasons, but their first handful of seasons in the Bigs weren't too kind to them. They may have had a worse record in their inaugural 1977 season, but I give the nod to their second season in 1978 because they were worse statistically, and you could figure 77 was just their first season in the league and they were going to go through growing pains. Their 59 and 102 record left them firmly at the bottom of the American League East, and it was their second of 3 straight 100-loss seasons to kickstart the franchise. Toronto's lineup was a patchwork of young prospects and journeymen, and the club's pitching staff was so often overmatched, posting a team ERA that hovered around .431, one of the worst in the league that season. They had some flashes here and there, but poor run support and ill-timed bullpen collapses doomed them. Offensively, the Blue Jays struggled mightily, managing a collective batting average of just .241, while finishing near the bottom of the majors in nearly every run-producing category. Their leading home run hitter was John Mayberry, who knocked 22 out of the park, but the rest of the lineup offered little support. How the Jays managed to win 5 more games than 77, I don't know. However, the Jays managed to build up a solid team by the early 80s, and then they became a World Series contender, but the team was treated like how Canada was treated by the United States in the nation's face-off. Number 18, the 2023 Colorado Rockies. Expecting this year's Rockies? Sorry to disappoint. At least we all knew the Rockies were going to suck ass this year. But in 2023, it was year 3 without Nolan Arenado, year 1 where they punted the season by cleaning house from a roster that was otherwise competitive in years past, and their first 100-loss season in franchise history. The nail in the coffin? It was year 2 of Chris Bryant's horrendous contract, and he has yet to even have a respectable season under it. What made this season especially bleak was the front office, in classic Rockies fashion, seemed vaguely optimistic coming into the year, banking on a mix of aging veterans, a couple of bounce-back candidates, and the hope that maybe the rest of the West would take a step back. Colorado's arms posted a ghastly team ERA north of 5, with only a handful of starters lasting the summer without a trip to IL or the minors. Offensively, the thin air did little to mask the Rockies' lack of power. The team batted a collective .249, managed just 149 home runs, and finished near the bottom of the majors in runs scored. Even Coors Field altitude couldn't save them from a franchise-worst season at the time. Number 17, the 2004 Kansas City Royals. Kansas City finished with a worse record in 2005, but I give 2004 the entry because the year before, the Royals finished 83-79. It came after a disastrous 100-loss season in 2002, and it appeared that their tanking and draft picks were falling into place, and the Royals were hyped to win the Central in 2004. Instead, they set the franchise record for most losses, had their second 100-loss season in the last 3 seasons. 2003 was seen as a fluke, and it was their first of 3 straight 100-loss seasons. Mike Sweeney and Ken Harvey were their best hitters, but it wasn't enough to bolster the offense. Meanwhile, their pitching staff did their best impression of a piñata all season, with 4 of their 5 starters having ERAs over 5. In fairness, Kansas City did have a lot of injuries that season, specifically with Benito Santiago, Juan Gonzalez, and Sweeney himself, but that's exactly why this gets the nod over 2005. Kansas City came in with expectations, and the season went as bad as it could possibly have gone. If only this could happen to Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. Number 16, the 1962 Chicago Cubs. Not even All-Star Game and prime Mr. Cub could help the Cubs here. At this point, the Cubs hadn't been a formidable franchise since losing the 1945 World Series, and you could argue that their core still needed development. However, what set 1962 apart was the infamous collage of coaches experiment, a bizarre system in which the Cubs attempted to rotate managers like students in a classroom, abolishing the idea of a single, steady hand at the helm. Predictably, disaster ensued. The team cycled through 4 different head coaches, failed to establish any continuity or direction, and stumbled to a 59-103 record, firmly establishing themselves as 9th in the National League, ahead only of the expansion Mets. I could have gone with 2012, but that season gave the Cubs the foundation of their core that helped them reach the NLCS in 2015 and eventually won the World Series the next year. After this, the Cubs had mediocre seasons plus a 1966 season that had the same record. They at least had good years after that, but this was the season that really gave the Cubs no sense of direction and killed fans' hope going forward. Number 15, the 2002 Milwaukee Brewers. Before this season, the Brewers were a mostly laughed-at franchise, but they had at least avoided last place most of the time. However, in 2002, the Brewers hit a new low as a franchise, going 56-106. It remains their only 100-loss season in franchise history, and they finished in last place for the first time since 1990. They had a couple of 20-plus home run hitters in Richie Sexson and Jose Hernandez, but that lineup was not formidable at all. Manager Dave Lopez was fired after a 3-12 start to the season, and things just never seemed to get better from there. The pitching was putrid, with every starter having an ERA above 4 and every starter losing 10 or more starts. Normally, I give a consolation prize for 100-loss seasons, but this was the season that made Brewers fans guzzle down their sorrows, because it wasn't until 2005 when Prince Fielder came on the scene and the franchise began to take a turn for the better, and it was all shot by their dreadful 2002 campaign. Number 14, the 2002 Tampa Bay Devil Rays. Remember when Tampa was just another small market team that no one cared about? Well, to be fair, they still kinda are, but they were more so than usual in the late 90s and early 2000s. At 55-106 in 02, it was their second straight 100-loss season, and this set the tone of how their growing pains went. The offense never found its footing, ranking at or near the bottom of every major team category. Collectively, the Rays batted just .253, hardly inspiring any confidence. Power was all but absent as well. The Their lineup managed just a mere 134 home runs and finished the season with just 682 runs scored, both numbers well below league average. Aubrey Huff was one of the few bright spots, launching 23 home runs and driving in 59, but there was little support behind him. The roster was a patchwork of reclamation projects and journeymen, and no amount of lineup shuffling would mask the team's glaring weaknesses. Unlike their pitching nowadays, Tampa's arms were night and day that allowed the league worst 918 runs, and the defense sucked major ass, racking up 137 errors for a dreadful .978 fielding percentage. Life is rough for most expansion franchises, and the Devil Rays seemed determined to set the standard for organizational ineptitude. It wasn't until they dropped the Devil out their name in '08 when they finally put it together as a franchise. Number 13, the 1972 Texas Rangers. It's your first season in Arlington. No one wanted you in DC. You were forgettable as a franchise as they come. The fans are welcoming you with open arms. You win your first game in Arlington, and then 54-100. Even though the franchise opened in DC with 4 straight 100-loss seasons, I give 1972 the cake because this was in the midst of another retool and relocating that didn't appear to help. Also, this season was worse record-wise and stat-wise than any of those first 4 seasons. Texas was dead last in team batting average with .217, scored the second fewest runs, the second fewest RBIs, and the 7th most strikeouts. Their pitching was mediocre, but a middle-of-the-pack to below-average staff won't complement a total disaster on offense no matter who you have. The Rangers were awful in '73 as well, going 57-105, but the lasting impression they left in the Lone Star State will be as bad as it gets for this franchise that should have 2 World Series titles. Number 12, the 1998 Florida Marlins. You're the defending champs. You're in your 6th season as a franchise, on cloud 9, win on opening day, and then lose 11 straight games, 17-38 at the end of May, and then have the biggest fire sale in all sports. Florida batted .257 but had no power and finished last in runs scored. Pitching was even worse with a .508 ERA, and the bullpen was an unmitigated disaster with the most blown leads in the league. After being 1-1, the Marlins never saw 500 for the rest of the season, and Joe Robbie Stadium saw many empty seats in a 54-108 season. No team in modern baseball took a more massive hit from their title defense, and this may very well be the worst defending champion in sports history. Number 11, the 1908 New York Yankees. Way back before even your great-grandparents were born and the Titanic was operational, there was an alternate universe when the Yankees were dreadful. The Yankees, back then known as the Highlanders, went 51-103, and they were more like the annoying back alley than Murder's Row with their offense. They batted a vomit-inducing .236 as a team with just 13 homers, 372 RBIs, and only 459 runs scored. A stat line that would make the Pirates accept the challenge with ineptness. Because of that, 4 of their starting pitchers lost 16 or more games, including 2 20-game losers. The ERA and WHIP were okay at .316 and .128 and struck out 585 batters. But with all the offensive struggles and little to no run support, New York just couldn't string together many wins. Charlie Hemphill was probably their best hitter, but even his resounding 0 homers wasn't enough to lift New York to glory. After this season, New York had a few mediocre seasons, changed their name to the Yankees after Howard Taft got stuck in the White House tub, and then went on to become the greatest franchise in sports history just a decade later. The reason I give this the nod over 1912 is because this was the season of futility that seemed to have come out of nowhere, whereas in 1912 it was more of just spinning the tires. Before they cucked Boston in the Babe Ruth deal, New York had no real direction as a franchise, and this was the season that started it. Why couldn't this shit happen in the 90s? Number 10, the 1908 St. Louis Cardinals. Oh look, another franchise who sucked donkey dick in 1908. If only it was my team to make them look less embarrassing. However, the only thing worse than watching your hated rivals, the Cubs, win the World Series in 1908 is when your team has their worst season ever at 49-105. Back then, the Cardinals had just finished signing their contract with the Devil for their luck going forward, and no one framed pitches, but before that, they were an often mocked franchise. Sure, it was the dead ball era, but none could help their top starter from losing 25 games. Disgusting. The team cycled through managers, cycled through players, and cycled through fans' patience, all without much to show for it. In a year when the crosstown Browns were mediocre but at least watchable, the Cardinals were simply the National League's doormat. This would be the last time to this date the Cardinals had a 100-loss season, but with the way their Gen Z fans bitch about ownership in the front office on social media, you'd think the Cardinals had like 3 or 4 100-loss seasons in the last decade. Number 9, the 2004 Arizona Diamondbacks. Tough call between this and 2021 when the Diamondbacks went 52-110 and had those infamous losing streaks, but I went with 04 because the NL West was weaker. Arizona was coming off an 84-78 season and were believed to be a playoff contender, and still had some pieces to their 2001 team that won the World Series. Instead, they lost the most games by an NL team since the 1965 Mets. With injuries ravaging the team and an offense that was utterly anemic, finishing dead last in the NL in runs scored, team batting average, and near the bottom in every relevant stat you could find. Their leading home run leader was switch hitter Shea Hillenbrand, who knocked just 15 out of the park, while Steve Finley and Luis Gonzalez both struggled to carry the load. Defensively and on the mound, things weren't any prettier. The D-backs pitching staff boasted a ghastly .498 team ERA, and no starter finished with a winning record. Brandon Webb and Randy Johnson pitching a perfect game were the only bright spots in this absolutely reprehensible 51-111 season. Number 8, the 2013 Houston Astros. Hey, remember when the Astros were straight up garbage and everyone actually pitied them? Those were fun days, as in the early 2010s, Houston rattled off 3 straight 100-loss seasons to build up the core they have now. No matter the context, it's terrible to lose that much consistently. At least 2011 gave him Jose Altuve's debut, and 2012 had him make the All-Star game, but if there was an indication that the rebuild was going nowhere and the fans' patience was waning, 2013 was the season. In their first season in the AL West, the Astros went 51-111 as their gradual downward spiral of those 100-loss seasons continued, batted .240 as a team OPS of .674, 610 runs scored, and Altuve easily had the worst season of his career, playing in a considerable 152 games. All those offensive stats, by the way, bottom 5. Their best starter was probably Eric Bedard, who went 4-12 with a .459 ERA and struck out 138, but Houston's bullpen and defense were atrocious all season. Their defense was well below league average all season, and at times looked like a blooper reel of errors. Now the Astros know all about winning ball games. Number 7, the 2023 Oakland Athletics. The A's had plenty of awful seasons, mostly when they were in Philadelphia and Kansas City, but to me, 2023 is their worst. Early in that season, the A's announced their intention to move, but chose the location to Las Vegas, and that was the moment the fans across the bridge had been dreading, with some of them being diehard fans since the A's had moved to Oakland in 1968. They gutted everything in 2022, and went 60-102, but the next season they started out 10-45, which is the worst record through 55 games in MLB history. Fans protested the move, 21-60 halfway through, and were on pace to be the worst team of all time, and not one player had an OPS above 840. Oakland was also dead last in runs scored, team batting average, and RBIs, and had the 6th most strikeouts. Pitching wasn't much better as they had a 5.48 team ERA, allowed the fourth most hits, allowed the second most runs, allowed the fifth most homers, and a laughable 152 whip. This is one of the few seasons where the record justifies the play, and the people of Vegas, or even Sacramento for that matter, deserve better. Number 6, the 1938 Philadelphia Phillies. Before there were the Pirates having 20 straight losing seasons, the eastern side of Pennsylvania suffered 16 straight losing seasons from 1933 to 1948. Out of all of them, my vote goes to the 1938 Phillies that went a putrid 45 and 105. Although 1941 saw a worse record, I chose this season because it was their second time in the last 3 seasons that the team lost 100 or more games, and this is when the Phillies were truly awful during their infamous slump. It was their first of 5 straight 100-loss seasons that ended up being 6 out of the last 7 seasons being such seasons, 1-10 at the end of April, lost 20 or more games in 3 months. The offense was mundane, but the pitching and defense was woeful all season. 3 of their starters lost 15 or more games. Only 1 starter had an ERA under 3, and their bullpen all had ERAs over 4. Their team ERA was a bloated 5.22, worst in the majors by a mile, and the staff allowed a staggering 915 runs. Not really sure what was worse this season for the Phillies or their uniforms. Number 5, the 2019 Detroit Tigers. Expecting 2003, sorry to disappoint. Here's the thing, as tragically awful as 2003 was, that season at least got the Tigers Justin Verlander in the draft the next season, and Detroit found themselves in the World Series just 3 years later. 2019, however, was like the straw that broke the camel's back with what the organization had gone through lately. In early 2017, Tigers owner Mike Ilitch passed away, and that was the start of the Tigers being bottom dwellers from 2017 to 23. The core was starting to be liquidated and kept aging players because either they believed they could still lead the team or because their contracts were so bad no one else would take it on. Top that with hiring a new manager in Ron Gardenhire in 2018, and 2019 was seen as the season where Detroit needed to stop kicking the can down the road. After back-to-back 64 and 98 seasons, Detroit sunk even lower, going 47 and 114. Their worst since that 03 season and first 100-loss season since then, and the second straight season where a team won fewer than 50 games. The season actually started out okay for the Tigers. They won 7 of their first 10 games and were only a game under 500 after April. Then shit hit the fan. They had stretches including 8 different losing streaks of 5+ games, including a season-long 9-game losing streak from May 13th through the 23rd. They had back-to-back 5-20 months in June and July and went 9-18 in August for good measure, and were nearly 30 games under 500 at the All-Star break. They were officially eliminated from playoff contention on August 24th. This season was years after Detroit were World Series contenders and an elite team in the league, and it made people forget that. I have to emphasize again that this is strictly my opinion, and this is the reason why I say 2019 was a worse season. But I will not argue with anyone who says 2003 was worse. At least everyone knew they were going to suck that year. Number 4, the 2018 Baltimore Orioles. Believe it or not, the Orioles have had 3 seasons where they lost 110+ games. The first came in 1939 as the St. Louis Browns, but that at least led them to the World Series just 5 years later. Their most recent came in 2021 when they went 52 and 110 when they had 2 losing streaks of 14 or more games, and their pitching was so bad that if you wanted to have a home run derby be more efficient, you'd have just had the Orioles pitching staff pitch to the batters in it. But for as awful as that season was, it was merely just a byproduct of the season that I chose for them, 2018. This takes the cake for me because they still had some of their core from contending days in the early 2010s, but most of it were on their way out and performed so badly, you could accuse them of intentionally tanking the season to get out of Baltimore and you wouldn't be wrong. Those players did leave the team by the trade deadline, and the Orioles were even more screwed than ever before. Nevertheless, Baltimore went a horrendous 47-115 and set numerous records for failure. At least 60 games behind the division winner, earliest playoff elimination since expansion. The second team this millennium and the first team since the 03 Tigers that won 50 or fewer games in a 162-game season. And then the big one, Chris Davis's entire season. Instead of reciting it, I'll just post the stats on the screen right here. This season started the direction that the Orioles are currently in right now. Lost identity, flying south for the entire summer, a front office that doesn't know how to develop talent, and no end in sight even with the few good seasons they had a few seasons ago. Number 3, the 2024 Chicago White Sox. There's simply no excuse for this. I've stated several times that records don't tell the whole story of how bad a season is, but 80 games under 500, the most losses in modern MLB, starting 3-22, 3 losing streaks of 12 or more games, including a 21-game losing streak that tied an American League record, setting a record for most losses at the All-Star break, setting a record for the quickest assurance of a losing season by losing 82 of their first 109 games, worst offense and pitching in every major stat for each respective category, and finally, firing your manager who compiled a record of 28-89. Yeah, that will easily put you on here. The worst of all is the Sox actually had some promise in years prior as they made the playoffs in 2020 and won the AL Central in 2021, and the rebuild looked like it was going well. Everyone thought their 61-101 season in 2023 was a fluke, and that the core they had would rebound. Instead, they became known as the worst team in MLB history. Number 2, the 1962 New York Mets. I don't care if it was their first season. Name me another season in Mets history that was worse than this. Other franchises have had way better first seasons, and if you win less than 50 games and barely get into the 40-win realm, you're going to find yourself on this list. The Mets entered the league, and they made a lasting impact with it as well. New York finished a whopping 60.5 games behind the NL champion Giants, had losing streaks of 17, 11, and 13. Starting pitchers tallied just 23 wins all season. 2/3 of their lineup batted under 250. Only one hitter was productive, and their 120 losses were the most in expansion era until the aforementioned 2024 White Sox broke it. However, New York still has a lower win percentage, so that makes them worse than the White Sox. Casey Stengel was manager, and not even he could help the newly founded Mets. This was the first of 4 straight 100-loss seasons to start the franchise, and after the Dodgers and Giants moved from NYC to California, people wondered why people in New York City went to Mets games over the Yankees games with this awful team. At least 7 years later, the Mets went on to shock the world by winning the World Series, but the same can't be said for the last team on this list. And now, the worst team on this list. Number 1, the 1935 Boston Braves. Not only because of the dreadful 38-115 record, but because the Braves were mediocre but not terrible in recent seasons, so for them to be this historically awful out of nowhere is just inexcusable. This season was so terrible that not even Babe Ruth could save them. He had declined in the 1934 season, but his deterioration became even more pronounced in 1935. He couldn't run, and his fielding was so terrible that 3 of the Braves pitchers threatened to go on strike if Ruth was in the lineup. A month into the season, Ruth stopped hitting as well. It soon became obvious that Babe's titles as vice president and assistant manager were a mere window dressing, and that he was only on the team due to the attention that he commanded. As a result, their opening day win was the only time they were over 500 all year. They won only 4 games in May and never recovered. By the time Ruth retired, they were 10-27, 16 and a half games out of first place, and their season was all but finished. They ultimately won only 28 more games to finish 38-115, the worst record in franchise history. Their .248 winning percentage is tied for 7th worst in MLB history. Wally Burger had a great season with 34 homers and 130 RBIs that both led the NL, but you would not be wrong in saying that this was the worst team in MLB history. But out of all the teams on this list, they have the worst season out of every current MLB franchise's worst seasons. Well, there you have it. That is every MLB team's worst season, at least in my opinion. I know a lot of you were expecting some other teams to be on here, but like I said, this list is more subjective than objective. But again, I will not argue if you think it's otherwise for certain MLB teams. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I certainly did. And it just goes to show you that you can never have anything nice if you're a baseball fan, regardless of how many times you've cheated or how many times your team's won the series.